Well, thanks, Tom, and it's great to see so many familiar faces and a whole bunch of new ones, and hoping that we'll see even more tomorrow. So I'm here to talk about the Reefense project, as we call it, which is a new project that started on June the 1st, and as Tom mentioned, it's funded by the US Department of Defense DARPA program. It's a big project with a big team, so I just want to recognize all of the team members that are listed here. There are 27 investigators from 11 different institutions, really all across the US. And as Tom mentioned, it really recognizes the fact that the Department of Defense realizes that the value of nature-based resources, in particular coral reefs, but also oyster beds is a good example, is really tremendous in terms of their ability to protect coastlines from storms. And this program really tries to advance the state of science to develop what are called hybrid reefs, reefs that combine the sort of instant benefits of an artificial structure with the sort of more long-term benefits of coral restoration in our case. And recognizing really that Florida, in fact, where we are now, as we all know too well, perhaps over the last few days, is probably one of the most suitable places in the world in terms of the amount of built infrastructure that is under threat from these kinds of storm surge impacts. And obviously with South Florida being so low-lying, that's a contributing factor. So what are X-reefs? This is a term that we sort of coined to refer to this idea of a hybrid reef that is a kind of a next generation version of a hybrid reef that combines these immediate wave protection benefits of artificial structures that we're all familiar with some of these ecological benefits of coral reefs, and which also incorporate these other ingredients of sort of novel ecological engineering approaches to try to prevent these structures from, for example, being overgrown by macroalgae or perhaps enhancing recruitment of baby corals to these structures. And also adaptive biology. How do we make the corals on these structures able to deal with the climate of the next few decades, and how do we make them more thermally tolerant, and how do we minimize trade-offs that might occur as a result of trying to increase their heat tolerance. So they're next-generation hybrid reefs that are designed to build both coastal and coral resilience. And the DARPA program invited everyone who applied to really address three what they call technical areas. TA1, technical area 1, was to do with the substrate design and the structure of the artificial base of the structure, looking at novel structures that minimize the amount of materials used, maybe use more biologically friendly types of concrete materials, as well as structures that more effectively break wave energy, attenuate wave energy, and materials that perhaps have a lower carbon footprint. At the same time, there's two other technical areas. Technical area 2 is ecological engineering, which was looking at ways, as I mentioned, to enhance the recruitment of corals to these structures, as well as decrease the overgrowth by macroalgae and other sort of biological unfriendlies from a coral perspective. And then this TA3 to do with boosting heat tolerance and climate resilience. And an important part of all this, which is really why I'm here today talking to you, is although this is a Department of Defense project and the targeted test site for this is in all probability going to be a military installation here in Florida, probably in fact the Naval Air Station Key West, which is about 100 miles south of here on US 1, 2.5 hour drive or so, just before you get to Key West. An important part of it is because it's principally a research and development project, it's not an implementation project. We will put out test structures, but it's really what we as biologists and in some cases structural engineers will learn from this project that could be applicable for reef restoration practitioners and other coastal defenders worldwide. So this is a sort of a conceptual diagram of the kind of thing that we're going to test and develop, addressing the three different technical areas. Technical area 1 in green, blue for TA2, and sort of brown for TA3. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time very quickly going over these different technical areas to sort of give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we're going to be testing and developing. So starting off with TA1, DARPA gives us some very aggressive goals to meet for each technical area, and the goals here are to reduce wave energy principally. As I mentioned, we'll be deploying two 50-meter long structures. The first structure won't actually go in for another year and a half or more, in fact, in month 24 of the project, and the second one will go in month 45. And so the intervening time that we spend between then is going to be developing and testing these structures in a state-of-the-science wave tank that we have at the University of Miami that's one of the largest in the world, capable of generating Category 5 hurricane force winds and waves in a pretty scaled testbed structure. And we're going to test a variety of different structures, including what you might consider to be sort of evolutionary approaches, things that are existing but perhaps haven't been adapted for their full value. And here are some examples of some sea hive structures that were developed at the University of Miami as a coastal protection defense, but also kind of revolutionary ideas, things that perhaps haven't been tested or a little bit novel, a little bit out of the box. And in this category in TA1, it's these kinds of structures that we're interested in testing, these concrete gyroid lattices that are modular and can be tiled together in different ways and are incredibly strong for the amount of material that they use. In addition, we're also going to be looking at some generatively designed coral mimics to sort of mimic the structure of elkhorn corals and perhaps effectively break wave energy even more effectively than elkhorn corals will do. And we'll be testing all of this in the wave tank as well as trying new novel materials. And here's some shots of the wave tank. Another big important component of this is also the hydrodynamic modeling of these structures at the site, which will also be done by members of the team. Moving on to TA2, the ecological engineering, the goals provided by DARPA are to reduce the amount of algal cover on the structure, as well as increase the recruitment sort of densities of corals there. And we're going to be using a variety of different approaches that are probably really familiar to the folks in the room here: asexual coral propagation, assisted coral recruitment, and community enhancement. And the kinds of things that we'll be doing here, and I should say that these technical areas are all led by different members of the team. TA1's led by Brian House at the University of Miami, and TA2 that we're talking about now is led by Margaret Miller of Seacorps International. So we'll be trialing a bunch of methods to not only asexually reproduce corals and plant them on structures and try to develop and identify more thermally tolerant genotypes, but also breed for increasingly resilient types. So there's a component here that involves coral spawning, a very large component in fact, and larval production, an investigation into the microbial and chemical settlement cues that coral babies are attracted to. And in some other novel approaches, we'll be trying to also use hydrogel encapsulation of larvae and bioprinting as a way of controlling the spacing of larvae and their settlement on a structure, or ultimately as a way of increasing the survivorship of the many hundreds of thousands of larvae that you all know we get. As well, we'll also be investigating some coatings, novel anti-algal coatings involving quaternary ammonium salts to try to reduce the attachment of macroalgae to the structure, and also use some tried and tested methodologies that you will also know about to do with crustose coralline algae to enhance recruitment. We're also investigating the use of certain types of concrete materials to increase the alkalinity saturation state in the boundary layer close to the surface of the structure as a way of potentially enhancing the calcification and growth of these early stage recruits to get them as big as possible, as quickly as possible, and sort of reach these size escape thresholds for predation and other factors like macroalgal overgrowth. And then finally for TA3, which is the TA that I lead myself, the goal here is to develop thermotolerant, fast-growing corals. I don't know if I'm biased here, but these goals seem to be significantly more challenging than some of the other TA2s. So as you'll see here, the goal here for phase 3, which is in the last 2 years of the 5-year program, is to try to develop corals that are up to 3 degrees centigrade tolerant, more temperature tolerant than sort of controls, unmanipulated. So it's a big ask, as I'm sure you'll all know. And the way we're going to go about trying to reach this is through 2 different means: recruit interventions involving, for example, algal symbiont manipulations in favor of heat-tolerant algal symbionts in the genus Duristinium in the Caribbean, as well as various approaches to condition recruits and stress-hardened recruits and look at the epigenetic modifications that might occur from some of those treatments and look to see whether those epigenetic modifications do result in an increase in resilience and how long they last and under what circumstances, et cetera. And also some probiotics looking at ways to develop and increase heat tolerance. The second component is to do with managed breeding. It's a very large component. We've definitely focused on sex as being the way in which we're going to achieve many of the goals of TA3. So we'll be sourcing parents with phenotypes of interest, whether it's thermotolerance or in fact disease resistance, as you all know is a big challenge in Florida for certain coral species. We'll be collecting gametes, not only in the wild, but also in ex situ facilities, such as the one you see here in the lower right at the Florida Aquarium. We will be investigating the use of hybrid acropora to grow on these what are effectively going to be incredibly shallow structures. So we need corals that can deal with high light and potentially turbid conditions, high wave energy, but which also are able to resist those wave impacts. And so we're interested in hybrid acropora as being a good candidate for that. We'll be investigating chimeras, so genetically distinct individuals that are growing and fused together. And sort of in general, leveraging the incredible power of larval production to test a whole variety of additional approaches and look at genomic biomarkers for some of these thermally tolerant traits. And I'll just close up quickly to say that I think, a big component of this is actually going to be inevitably international. Even though you might think of the US Department of Defense as being a very US-centric agency, the solution to the coral reef crisis, as I think we all know, has to be an international one. And I think just from a biologist looking at the broad variety of thermal tolerance around there in these populations around the Caribbean, it's clear to any of us that there are different environments and diverse thermal regimes around the Caribbean, and that ought to be leveraged in the search for these genotypes and the breeding programs that these genotypes leverage. And so, just here in Florida, you can see that there are significant differences in maximum monthly mean temperatures, which is kind of a good proxy for the thermal tolerance of the corals that are found there. But as we move further afield, there are clearly other populations that will be worth investigating as either sources for translocation or sources for breeding. And some of the examples that we've already begun to explore with colleagues, both related to DARPA as well as other projects, in particular the NOAA Ruth Gates program, is, we've looked at how you can translocate or in some cases exchange genotypes between locations, say from Key Largo to Miami, about 80 kilometers or 50 miles, or the Dry Tortugas to Miami, which is about 275 kilometers, and that's kind of equivalent to the distances to Bimini or Nassau. And so I think throwing the net wider to capture more genetic diversity, I think, is really critical to solving some of these problems that we face. And other candidate ecosystems that we're interested in would include places like the Gardens of the Queen in Cuba, where maximum monthly mean temperatures are significantly more higher than those we see in Florida by a degree centigrade or more. But just moving even further afield from this, I think we've come to the point where, certainly me personally, I'm becoming much more interested in the idea of a network of shared genetic resources across the Caribbean. And as we move further afield, we've already begun breeding corals between Florida and Mexico. We did our first crosses just last month of Mexican and Florida elkhorn coral as a way to actually try to enhance the genetic diversity of Florida's elkhorn corals. Thanks to Anya Banaszak and folks in my lab for that effort. And we may consider Belize as being another candidate location for this. And I think as we move forward, there are other interesting questions to look at, not just for this species, but for others. And if anyone's interested in hearing more about these approaches or ideas, I'll actually be talking more about this tomorrow, so I'm not going to talk more here. But I'd like to talk about the philosophy of these approaches in that talk. So to close up, that's a very brief overview of the whole project, which, as you can see, includes many partners, many different directions, and a very interdisciplinary project. And this figure came from the National Academy's report from a couple of years ago, and I think it's quite a good illustration of the general approach, which is how do we assemble teams with really diverse interests and diverse expertise and actually force them to work together at a particular site of interest where all of the constellations converge, where you can actually work productively together. And I think actually Southeast Florida is one of those locations. And so this graphic kind of illustrates that very well, where we have a reef, we have a challenge, we've got labs, and we've got personnel. So it's a question of, I think, in the case of the DARPA program, being really forward-thinking and realizing this is an exciting opportunity to really scale up and try things that we haven't tried before and build networks that, in my experience, generate more and more ideas the more those people begin to work together. But of course, none of this is a substitute for the challenge we face as coral biologists, which is one of emissions reductions or carbon sequestration that ultimately solves the climate crisis in the first place. And so, I think the idea of hybrid reefs is a good one when thought of in the light, or when considered in the light of managed retreat and mitigation strategies that help us buy time to solve some of these problems. But it is very much a temporary solution. These reefs are not going to save South Florida from sea level rise. They'll just save us from the immediate pain of sea level rise, which is the storm surge and the property damage that's going to plague us for the next couple of decades before eventually the mean sea level rises in the sense that it becomes unsustainable. And so I'm just going to close with one final thought. I'm going to channel my inner Mike Beck here, who's actually a part of the DARPA team, and point out that we've heard some discussions about growing the pie for how do we finance these kinds of operations, and some really ambitious estimates of what it's going to take. And I think one of the things that I really see as coming down the pipeline is the use of reefs, and in particular hybrid reefs, as a mitigation strategy and a means of emergency preparedness through funding sources like FEMA that come in after storms to rebuild infrastructure. And in this case, we can consider green infrastructure, or at least green-gray infrastructure, as a means to that end. And the amount of money that's available for those kinds of operations typically dwarfs the kind of money that we've been used to dealing with in coral restoration field. So I'm just going to close there and once again thank all of the X-Reefs team that I've mentioned before, as well as all the folks in my own lab who have been sort of heavily involved with not only the production of this proposal, but also the work now that it's actually begun. And so I just want to thank all of them. It really does take a village, and the project would be substantially less without any of the individuals that are named here. So with that, I'm done. Thanks a lot.